The knife fell from Cheek's hands and clattered against the earthen floor. His body convulsed once, twice, then went rigid. Foam gathered at the corners of his mouth as his eyes rolled backward, showing only whites. His mother knelt beside him, pressing her palms against his burning skin, but she already knew what this meant. The sickness had returned, the one that had nearly taken him when he was a child, the one that the healers said would claim him before the next moon rose. She looked at her hands, calloused from 20 years of washing cloth at the river, stained from grinding herbs nobody could afford to buy, and wondered if they were enough anymore. Around them, the village of Kibwe had grown quiet. Word spread quickly through the settlement. Cheek, the blacksmith's boy, was dying again. But Cheek was no longer a boy. He was 23 seasons old, strong enough to forge metal that other men feared to touch, skilled enough that traders from 3 settlements over came to commission his work. Yet here he lay, shaking like a leaf in Harmattan wind, and his mother could only sit beside him and pray to ancestors who had never answered before. The question that burned in her chest was this: why had she not married again after his father died? Why had she chosen this life of endless labor, endless hunger, endless loneliness? And now, watching her son slip away despite everything she had sacrificed, she wondered if God was finally collecting on a debt she did not remember owing. Amma was not his mother. This was the first truth Chike would learn when he woke 3 days later, drenched in sweat that smelled like rotting fruit. Amma was his father's second wife, a woman his father had married in secret during Chike's infancy, a union his mother did not discover until after his death. A woman who had no obligation to this boy who carried another woman's name in his bones. Yet when the fever came that first time, when Chika was only 5 seasons old, it was Amma who sat beside him through the nights that seemed to stretch longer than time itself. It was Amma who chewed medicinal leaves and pressed them against his gums. It was Amma who sang to him in a language he later learned was her mother's language, brought from a settlement far to the north. It was Amma who bathed him in rainwater mixed with bark from the sacred tree, speaking softly about ancestors who would protect him, about spirits who watched over children born under the sign of the fish. Cheek's true mother died when he was 7 seasons old. A simple thing, a cut on her foot while washing cloth at the river. An infection that spread like wildfire through her blood. Within 2 weeks, she was ash scattered to the wind. It was Amma who raised him after that, not because she was required to, not because the village expected it. The village, in fact, whispered that she should let him go to his father's first family, that a boy needed his blood mother's lineage, not a stranger's pity. But Amma ignored the whispers. Amma fed him when the harvest was lean. Amma taught him the blacksmith's craft by holding his small hands over hers as she worked the forge. Amma braided his hair and covered his eyes when the village elders made decisions she deemed too harsh for a child to witness. By the time he reached manhood, Cheek had forgotten he was not born from her womb. His father had died when Cheek was 12, leaving nothing but debts and the blacksmith's tools. Amma had worked as a cloth washer, a food seller, a healer's assistant, whatever work came, to keep them alive while Cheek learned his father's trade. He was tall, taller than most men in Kibwe. His shoulders were broad like an ox's back, and his hands could bend iron as though it were raffia. His face was beautiful in the way that a stone sculpture is beautiful. Sharp angles, deep-set eyes, a mouth that rarely curved into smiles, but when it did, seemed to light the entire settlement. The women of Kibwe noticed, the mothers noticed, the traders noticed, but Chike noticed only Amma, the way she limped slightly when she thought no one was watching, a legacy of the early years when hunger had bent her bones, the way she still hummed the old songs in her mother's language while preparing meals, the way her hands trembled slightly when she touched his face, as though she could not quite believe he was still alive, still hers. He swore to her once, when he was 17, and the fever had not returned in 5 whole seasons, that he would take care of her for the rest of her life. He swore it on the sacred tree, on the river, on the bones of his ancestors. He swore it while gripping her weathered hands, while looking into her eyes that had become lighter with age, like wells running dry. "I will make you proud," he said. "I will become the best blacksmith in all the settlements. I will make enough money to build you a compound with walls of stone. I will buy you cloth from the northern traders. I will hire servants to wash your feet. I will give you rest." Amma smiled. She touched his face. She said nothing, but her silence held 1,000 words. Gratitude, love, perhaps also a terrible, prescient sadness. The knife fell from Cheek's hands the day Omotola arrived in Kibwe. She came with her father, a wealthy trader who owned palm oil plantations across 4 settlements. She came in a litter, carried by 4 men, wearing wrappers dyed with colors that did not exist in nature. Red so bright they seemed to bleed, yellows like captured sunlight. Her neck was wrapped in gold chains, so heavy that she held her head at an angle, as though perpetually listening to music only she could hear. Her jeel, her head wrap, was so tall and so perfectly constructed that it seemed to defy all reasonable laws of balance. Her eyebrows had been plucked into thin arcs that made her face look permanently surprised. Her lips were stained with something that made them appear wet and swollen, like fruit left too long in the sun. She was, without question, the most beautiful woman the village of Kibwe had ever seen. She arrived to commission a bronze door, an enormous thing with carved patterns that would mark her father's new merchant house as a building of extraordinary wealth. The merchant himself brought the design, described the intricacy required, and mentioned casually that they would pay whatever price Chiki demanded. The family had money beyond reckoning, he said. The work would need to be perfect, but perfection would be handsomely rewarded. Cheek accepted the commission. He began his work, spending entire days at the forge, his body moving through the ancient patterns of his father's trade, heating, hammering, cooling, shaping. He did not notice at first that Omotola had begun to watch him. She would appear at the workshop in the late afternoon, always wrapped in a different color, always trailing the scent of something sweet and foreign, oils that came from lands beyond the sea, Chike would later learn. She would stand at a careful distance, far enough not to seem interested, near enough to observe every movement of his hands. "My father says you are talented," she said one afternoon. It was the first time she had spoken directly to him. Her voice was nothing like he expected. It was thin and high, like a bird's call. It did not match her body, which was lush and rounded in every place a woman was supposed to be rounded. "Your father is kind," Cheek replied, not looking at her. His hands continued their work. "I did not ask what my father thinks," she said. "I asked what you think. Are you talented?" This time, he looked at her. Her eyes were lined with something dark that made them appear enormous. They were beautiful, predatory, like a cat's eyes in the dark. "I am adequate," he said. She smiled. "Modesty is also a form of lying." She began to return every day. She brought cola nuts and placed them on his workspace. She brought palm wine and left it where he could reach it without asking. She asked him questions. Where had he trained? Who had taught him? What did he dream about? Did he ever want to leave this small village and see the world? Her questions were soft and casual, the way water finds its way around stone. At the market, the women stopped their trading to gossip. "Did you see how the merchant's daughter looks at the blacksmith?" one whispered, balancing a clay pot of oil on her head. "She is circling him like a hyena circles a wounded animal," another said, spitting into the dust. Amma heard the whispers. She always heard the whispers. She said nothing to Chike. She continued to prepare his meals, to wash his clothes, to keep the compound clean. But something shifted in her movements. She began to move more slowly, as though her body had become heavier. The light in her eyes dimmed slightly, like a lamp running low on oil. When Omotola's father came to Chike with a marriage proposal, Chike felt the world tilt. The merchant offered a bride price that was obscene, 5 times what any other woman in the village would cost. He offered to build Chica a new workshop, to supply him with the finest metal from the northern markets, to establish him as the merchant's exclusive blacksmith for all his trading ventures. He offered, in essence, to make Chica wealthy beyond the dreams of any man in Quibue. "My daughter has chosen you," the merchant said. "She is picky, but when she sees something she wants, she does not let it go. I am a practical man. I reward my daughter's desires. You would be foolish to refuse." Chiki looked at Omotola, standing behind her father in her colors and her gold and her impossible beauty. He thought about the compound with walls of stone, the northern cloth, the servants to wash feet. He thought about being somebody, about mattering, about being seen. He said yes. He told Amma that evening. He sat across from her in their small hut and told her that he would be married in the next moon. He told her that she would no longer need to work, that he would build her a separate compound, that she would be cared for always, that her sacrifice had not been forgotten. Amma listened. She did not cry. Her hands did not tremble. She simply nodded as though he had told her something she already knew, something she had been waiting to hear for a long time. "I am happy for you," she said. And he believed her, because Amma had never learned to lie. The wedding ceremony was elaborate. The merchant brought drummers from the capital. He brought cloth from across the sea. He brought wine that cost more than most families in Quibue earned in a season. The entire village came to watch the blacksmith, the boy everyone had written off as cursed, the boy with the fever that should have killed him, elevate himself to a status they could barely fathom. During the ceremony, Chiki barely looked at Omotola. He barely looked at Amma, who sat in the back, wearing the same wrapper she had worn to his father's funeral. He looked at his future. He looked at his escape from Quibue, from poverty, from the life of a blacksmith's son. The villagers gasped. Some covered their mouths, others whispered. "He has forgotten where he came from," one elder said, shaking his head beneath the great tree. "The boy had gratitude. The man has none," another replied, and the others nodded in grave agreement. Cheek moved into the merchant's compound. It was a palace compared to anything in Quibue. The walls were stone, as he had dreamed. The floors were smooth and cool. The furniture was carved from hardwoods that gleamed like water. Omotola had chambers filled with cloth and jewelry and cosmetics. Chiki had workshops filled with the finest materials he had ever touched. Within 3 months, he had designed and created the bronze doors that would become famous across 3 provinces. They were a masterpiece, intricate patterns that seemed to move when you looked at them, scenes of traders and warriors and women dancing at festivals. Word spread. Wealthy merchants came from the capital itself to commission work from the blacksmith who could bend bronze into poetry. Chiki became famous. He became wealthy. He became the man he had sworn to become. But something was wrong with Omotola. At first, it was small things. She would ask him to make decisions about the household, then criticize every decision he made. She would ask about his past, then mock the poverty he had escaped. She would wear something new, and when he complimented it, she would laugh, a thin, cruel sound, and say that his taste was rustic, that he would never truly understand beauty, that he should simply make bronze and leave the finer things to people who understood them. He realized gradually that she had never actually liked him. She had wanted him. She had pursued him with the intensity of a hunter pursuing prey. But liking and wanting are different things. She had wanted to prove that she could take the village blacksmith and make him hers, could elevate him or destroy him according to her whims. Now that she had accomplished this, now that he was hers, the thrill was gone. He became, over the months, something she despised, a reminder of where she had come from, a man she had chosen who would never be refined enough, never be wealthy enough in his own right, never be worthy of her. The cruelty escalated. She began to criticize his body, too muscular, too scarred, too marked by labor. She began to insult his speech. His accent was too village, his words too simple, his understanding of refined conversation non-existent. She began to refuse him her chamber, sleeping instead in the room where her most expensive cloth was stored, surrounding herself with her possessions rather than her husband. At the Palm Wine Bar, the men spoke in hushed tones. "He traded his mother for a woman who hates him," one said bitterly. "Some bargains cost more than money," another replied. "He will pay for his ingratitude," a third added, and the others nodded. But there was no satisfaction in their agreement, only a kind of sad certainty. Amma, meanwhile, had disappeared into the margins of village life. She no longer washed cloth at the river. A younger woman had taken that work. She was too old to serve as a healer's assistant. The traders had no use for her. She had become the village's forgotten woman, the one who had raised a son who abandoned her, the one whose sacrifice had bought nothing but loneliness. Cheek sent money. He sent cloth from the northern traders. He sent servants to build her a small compound, separate from the one she had lived in with him. But he did not visit. He told himself he was too busy. He told himself that Omotola required his attention. He told himself that Amma was provided for, and that was enough. He did not allow himself to think about the last time he had seen her. At his wedding, sitting alone in the back, wearing her old wrapper, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes looking at him as though she was memorizing the last moment she would ever truly see him. 2 seasons passed. Cheek's fame had spread to the capital itself. A nobleman commissioned a bronze sculpture so complex that it would require 2 full seasons of work. The payment would make Chiki wealthier than the merchant himself. This was the moment he had been working toward his entire life. This was the moment that would cement his status, prove that he had transcended his origins, show everyone that the blacksmith's son had become somebody. It was the night before he was to begin this work that the fever returned. It came suddenly, without warning. One moment he was standing at the forge, examining his tools, and the next, his vision began to swim. His legs gave way. He collapsed onto the stone floor of his magnificent workshop, and his body began to convulse in the exact same way it had when he was a child, when he was 5 seasons old and terrified of dying, when he learned that Amma would sit beside him through the darkness and hold his hand and sing to him until the fever broke. The physicians came from the capital. They examined him, shook their heads, prescribed remedies that cost more money than the village of Kibwe saw in a year. Nothing worked. The fever continued. Cheek drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind fracturing into pieces, his memories jumbling together. The forge, the hammer, the shape of bronze, the face of a woman who had saved him more times than he could count, the face of a woman who had chosen to leave his chamber and sleep instead with her cloth. Omotola stood above him, with her hands on her hips, her face twisted with disgust. "You are disgusting," she said coldly. "Sweating like an animal, moaning like a creature. I cannot remain in this room. It smells like death and village sickness. Move to the servants' quarters until you recover, or don't recover. I find that I do not much care which." And she left, and Cheek lay alone. It was in this moment, in this absolute nadir of his existence, that Amma came. No one had told her, but she knew. Old women in villages like Kibwe, women who have spent their lives reading the smallest signs, the pattern of birds flying, the way the wind carries scent, the messages whispered through the network of water women and market traders. They always know. They know before the news arrives officially. They know with the certainty of those who have spent decades listening to the language that runs beneath language. She came to the merchant's compound as the sun was setting. The servants tried to stop her, but she walked past them as though they were not there. She walked past Omotola, who was arranging cloth in her bedroom. She walked directly to Chika's chamber. He was barely conscious. His skin had turned the color of ash. His breathing was shallow and rattling, like wind through a hollow tree. For a moment, she simply stood in the doorway and looked at him. This man she had raised from a fever-racked child, This man she had taught to forge metal and to be kind. This man she had loved more completely than she had ever loved anything, and who had left her in the margins of his new life. Then she began to work. She called for water and cloth. She bathed him as she had bathed him when he was small, her hands moving with the efficiency of someone who has performed this task 1,000 times. She cleaned the sweat from his skin. She wrapped him in cloth that she had brought from her own compound, cloth she had washed at the river for decades, cloth that carried the scent of her labor and her love. Then she sat beside him, and she began to sing. The song was old. It was the song she had sung to him when he was 5 and terrified, when he was 7 and grieving his mother, when he was 12 and learning his father had died, when he was 15 and beginning to understand that the world would not be kind to him. The song was in her mother's language, the language from the settlement far to the north that she had carried all her life like a secret. The words meant, "I am here, I am here, I am here. You are not alone, you are not forgotten. I am here." She sang it through the night. She sang it as his fever raged. She sang it as he called out names of people who had died, people who had left him, people he had disappointed or disappointed him. She sang it as his body shook and his mind fractured and his spirit seemed to stand at the edge of a dark abyss, looking into it, deciding whether to step across or to reach back toward the light. And in the morning, the fever broke. Cheek woke to the sight of Amma's face inches from his own. She had fallen asleep in her chair, her head tilted at an angle, her mouth slightly open. She looked smaller than he remembered, more fragile, as though she might break if he touched her too hard. Her hands, crossed in her lap, were covered with new scars, burns from the work she continued to do, marks from a life spent in service. He lay there and looked at her. And he understood, with a clarity that felt like a knife entering his chest, that she had never stopped loving him. Not for a moment. Not when he had left her at his wedding. Not when he had sent money instead of coming himself. Not even now, when he had become the man she had wanted him to become, and then discovered that man was empty, that the status and wealth meant nothing without the foundation of love that had built him. He understood, too, that he could not return to being the man he had been before. That was impossible. Too much had changed. The poison of Omatola's contempt had seeped too deep into his veins. He had been shaped into a different form, and no amount of time could change him back. But he could choose to see her. He could choose to acknowledge her. He could choose, in whatever time remained, to do better. In that moment, something broke open in him, the part of himself that had been sealed shut since the day he said yes to Omatola's father, since the day he had chosen a future over gratitude. For the first time in 3 seasons, he wept. His body shook with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than grief, from a place beyond sadness, from the profound regret of a man who had thrown away the only true wealth he had ever possessed. Amma woke to the sound of his weeping. She sat up, startled, reaching for his face. And when she saw his tears, she began to cry as well, not for joy, but for sorrow, for the years lost, for the woman he had married and chosen over her, for the man he had become and could not undo. "I am sorry," Chike whispered. It was all he had. It was everything, and it was nothing. "I know," Amma said, and she took his hand. Over the following weeks, as Cheek's body recovered, a strange thing happened in the merchant's compound. Omatola, upon discovering that Amma was now permanently residing in her husband's chambers, nursing him, sleeping in a chair beside his bed, became enraged. She demanded that Amma be removed. She threatened to leave him. She called him names that would have shamed a lesser man. Chike, for the first time since his marriage, did not apologize, did not negotiate, did not attempt to smooth her anger or prove his worth to her. He simply looked at her and said, "You are free to go. There is nothing here for you." Omatola packed her cloth, her jewelry, her imported cosmetics. She took with her the bride price and the bride price of 3 future husbands besides, men more properly wealthy, more properly refined, men from the capital who had not been raised in villages and would not constantly remind her of places she had chosen to forget. She left a message with the servants that her father would be collecting her belongings from the merchant house and that Cheeky could keep whatever dowry had been sent. She did not say goodbye. She did not look back. The village learned of this within days. Word spread like wildfire through the settlement. At the river, the women gathering water spoke of nothing else. "The merchant's daughter has left the blacksmith," one whispered. "He was not refined enough for her after all," another said, shaking her head. "Perhaps he is learning the cost of his choices," a third replied, and the others nodded, but it was a gentle nodding, touched with something like compassion. The elders gathered under the great tree and spoke with quiet satisfaction. "The river collects its debts," one said. "He chose to forget the hand that fed him when he was starving," another replied. "And now the river has collected what it was owed." The others nodded, and there was something almost kind in their agreement, as though they were satisfied not with his pain, but with the restoration of balance. But Cheek was not thinking about the village's judgment or the satisfaction of elders who believed in karma and cosmic debt. He was thinking about the woman who had never left him, not in the way that mattered. He changed his life after that, not dramatically. He did not renounce his wealth or return to the simple life of a village blacksmith. But he built his new compound differently. He placed Amma's chamber at the center of it, not the periphery. He hired servants to help her, to ease the burden of her labor, to allow her to rest in the way he had promised so many seasons ago when he was young and full of hope. He took her to the northern traders and bought her cloth in colors that she loved, soft greens and deep blues, not the garish reds and yellows that Omatola had favored. He hired musicians to play the old songs in her mother's language on the festival days. He did not become the man he had once imagined he would become. That man was gone, burned away in the fever, destroyed by a marriage to someone who had never loved him. But he became something different. He became a man who understood that the greatest wealth is not bronze or cloth or the admiration of strangers. It is the presence of someone who has loved you when you were worthless, who has held your hand in the darkness, who has sung to you when all hope seemed lost. Years passed. Cheek continued his work, creating bronze pieces that were coveted across provinces. But his most famous work was not the commissioned sculptures or the elaborate doors. It was the gate he created for his own compound, a gate with patterns that seemed to tell a story. A young man in fever-racked agony, an old woman singing beside him, a moment of reunion, a moment of forgiveness, carved into bronze so that it would last beyond their lives, beyond the village, beyond the reach of time. The people who saw this gate understood immediately what it meant. It was a story about betrayal and grace. It was a story about a debt collected and a debt forgiven. It was a story about the woman who had taught a blacksmith that love is the only metal that does not rust, the only craft that does not require fire to be shaped, the only treasure that increases the more it is given away. And so the village learned what Cheeky had finally understood, that gratitude is the rarest currency in a man's life, rarer than gold, rarer than bronze, rarer than all the wealth of the capital combined. A man who forgets who held his hunger when no one else would, who forgets who sang to him in the darkness, who forgets who chose to love him when he was worthless, that man will never truly be wealthy, no matter what fortune he accumulates. But a man who remembers, who returns, who chooses again the person who never stopped choosing him, that man is richer than princes. The woman called servant was revealed as the true gold, and the woman in her expensive cloth and her imported oils was revealed as the true rat, scurrying from one richer hole to the next, never finding rest, never finding home.